Good morning. Shalom Aleichem. Welcome to 10 Minutes of Torah. As I mentioned, it's a special week. Every week is special, every day is special, but this is a special week because this is the week when we receive the Torah. Now you may ask, didn't we receive the Torah already? And the answer is, of course. We received it over how many years ago? Over 2,000 years ago. More. 4,000. And change. We had the Beis HaMikdash 2,000 years ago. So, if it was given already, why are we still getting it? So, one of the ways of seeing it is that even though Torah was Matan Torah was a singular event, it was given, but the act of receiving Torah is a continuous, ongoing action. A continuous loop of receiving that allows us to see our interaction with Torah in a way that keeps it fresh, in a way, Kol yom v'yom tia b'einecha kechadashim. It should be new to you every single day. Unfortunately, there's no shortage to the depth, the infinite depth of Torah. Hafachba v'hafachba, you can dig there and dig there, and never. There's always something about Torah that remains unfathomable. It's a gesund. That remains beyond our reach, and it's not an accident. It's not because, if only there would be one person who's smart enough, they would master Torah, and part of the reason why that's not the criteria is also the reason that we continue receiving it, and why we can reenact the giving of the Torah, which we read about in this week's portion, and do so genuinely with real excitement, because it's not just good literature. In fact, it's not great literature as far as literature goes, because it's all out of sequence. Ein mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah. It's clear when you open up this book that you're not opening up a book that was the result of human ingenuity, human creativity. It's divine. And that's part of what we reflect on when we read Parshat Yitro. When we read about the giving of the Torah, we re-evaluate our understanding of Torah, and it's an opportunity to deepen our understanding of Torah, particularly our relationship with its divine nature. Which raises an interesting question. If we've gone out of our way to emphasize and point out the utterly divine nature of Torah, so much so that it allows us, that divine nature itself allows us to sit here many, many thousands of years later and re-experience it as something whose depths we haven't even begun to approach. whom even the greatest master hasn't mastered, because it is divine, because it is lofty and sublime. And yet we find that the most I wouldn't say troubling, but the most the most obvious feature of Torah is the way it manifests itself in the context, in the terms of human consciousness, not divine consciousness. If you read the Midrashic accounts, and there are many, of the giving of the Torah, one of the mantras that you hear over and over again is the way that up until this moment, there was a wall between, for lack of a better term, let's call it, there was a division between heaven and earth. And as King David said, because nobody says it quite like King David, it says, Hashemayim shemayim laHashem, the heavens are the heavens of God, that's his place. The haaretz, and earth, nasan levnei adam, was given to us. We each have our fixed domains. And our human nature supports this division, supports our natural realization that though we may contain within us, sometimes it's more, we're more connected to it, sometimes less, a heavenly something, let's call it our soul, let's call it our mind, let's call it our spirit. It's of the divine, and it's in us, within us, and yet it is of heaven, it is of Shamayim. We are, nevertheless, despite the flashing of that truth and occasional glimpses of our heavenly side, we are creatures of earth. We are Eretz people. And God, despite his tendency to show himself as being in some way connected or trying to connect to us in the earthly human framework, is primarily the God of heaven, or at least conventionally, those are the fault lines. And Sinai changed all that. Sinai was a shattering of the barriers between heaven and earth. All of the fixed demarcations that suggested that the spiritual realm is not the place of the human, and the human realm is not the place of God, were wiped out, and everything was redrawn. It was the boundaries became permeable. Elyonim yardu l'tachtonim, that which was on high descended to the lower worlds, ve'elyonim alu and vice versa. And that which was, and suddenly, the primary focus of Torah became physical nature and our interaction with it. So whereas before this moment, the patriarchs, for example, were Torah aficionados. They had downloaded Torah from up above. They were unique. They were spiritually skilled. And they were able to mess with those boundaries, unlike most people. But their interaction with God through the middle ground of Torah was primarily spiritual. So if Jacob put on tefillin, it says that he used sticks. And when he finished davening with these weird sticks that he used, he threw the sticks away. Crazy. How could you throw away your tefillin? Imagine you put on your tefillin and then, like disposables. Because the primary focus wasn't the physical item that he used. That was just a formality. The emphasis was on experiencing a spiritual moment. Suddenly, after the giving of the Torah, everything changed. And there was, if you wanted to connect with God, for example, through the mitzvah of tefillin, there was a very prescribed way of doing that. And that's come down to us through years and years of the interpretation of the Torah Shebal Peh, exactly what tefillin is, what it consists of from the physical world, how to make the tefillin, how to hold them, where to put them, how to wrap them. This is not a spiritual manual. If anybody is like in the spiritual world and says, let me explore the Jewish spiritual tradition, they could look through the code of Jewish law for 10 years and they wouldn't really find any halachot, any laws that prescribed the kavanot, the mental consciousness that is meant to accompany the mitzvah, which is extremely important from a Jewish perspective and is part of the Kabbalistic and spiritual side, and there you'll find plenty of it. But you won't find in the laws of eating matzah any kind of a lengthy halachic debate about fulfilling your thought requirement. It's only how much, what is matzah? How do you make matzah? What makes matzah kosher? What makes matzah unkosher? And how much of the matzah do you have to eat? And when do you eat it? And furthermore, even though the matzah is meant to actually remind us of something spiritual, so it's actually a mitzvah that is set up to be performed much more, in a way that's much more aligned with our spiritual side, our imagination, invoking memory. And one could easily argue that without the matzah, one could invoke that memory of the Exodus and fulfill that obligation. Although one could also acknowledge that memory alone can be less of an intense experiential moment, and the physical act of eating the matzah evokes a more visceral connection in the realm of memory, and that would be a reasonable suggestion. But it's nevertheless not reasonable to flip the functions. And yet, if you sat at night without matzah on Passover night, and you thought and thought and thought, and you meditated on every permutation of every possible Kabbalistic formula that's related to the eating of the matzah, and the ways that through eating the matzah, the worlds, the esoteric worlds of Atzilut and Bria come together in a wondrous yichud, in a wondrous unity, and it aligns all the worlds that have been, the spiritual worlds that have been out of alignment, etc., etc. All this without a little bite of matzah. Guess what? You didn't fulfill the mitzvah. So this Torah that we're talking about, that we're celebrating today, this week, that is so deep because it is so divine, is experienced primarily, and this is the irony, not in the world of thought, not in the more spiritual world, but in the world of action. And so, when those barriers between heaven and earth broke, obviously we were given the deepest and most fulfilling source of spiritual connectedness. But we were also given a format that made it entirely clear that the primary vehicle for the flourishing, the blossoming of this relationship has to take place in the realm of the physical. And that's the greatest irony. And theologians in Jewish, throughout Jewish history, have struggled with it. And some have outsmarted Torah by realigning the emphasis back on the spiritual so as to ennoble the Torah, so as to feel enlightened along with holding on to Torah and changing its. And I think that doesn't come without a high cost, because when something is set up fundamentally to function in a certain way, it's not an accident. And the Rebbe, in his revolutionary way, paved the way to a much more profound understanding of the intentionality and the rightness of the spiritual drama that we call Judaism. The stage that it plays out on, the human stage, is not an accident, is not an afterthought. It's very much in line with the plan, with the notion of why we're here in the first place. We're here because we're part of a Judaism that the Rebbe sees primarily from the lens from a godly lens, from an activist perspective. Why are we here? The why is very central in Hasidic thinking, particularly in the Rebbe's approach. We're here because we are part of a purpose-driven lineage. We're part of a purpose-driven program. And the world around us, in the world of the Rebbe, is not the enemy that we have to tolerate, is not an inconvenient hurdle that we have to overcome along the way to a Jewish version of spiritual enlightenment. That defeats the whole purpose. That is the tefillin, wrapped specifically in that way. And the eating of the matzah, regardless of whether you thought about it even for 1 second. Because if you eat that piece of matzah and you don't want to eat it, and actually somebody put a gun to your head and said, either eat this matzah or I'll kill you, if you can imagine a bizarro scenario like that. And so you eat it and you say the blessing. Did you fulfill the purpose of the eating of the matzah? Did you do the mitzvah? Even though psychologically and philosophically and emotionally you were not there, you didn't want it. You didn't want it. And the answer is yes, because there's a critical dimension of Judaism that puts us in a place of, it's not about you. You're not the center of the universe. You're put here to recalibrate the way that the world looks, the way it seems, the way it feels. And you were given Torah. Now, there are times when all of that aligns, and whatever God needs us to do can be done and achieved, and we can feel really good along the way. Or we can just be like that kid who has to go along for the ride and doesn't want to go with the rest of the family on that long road trip and is sitting there, but you're going because this is what we do. And there's an added bonus of thinking this way, because it allows us to broaden our emotional and psychological world to encompass Judaism. Because in the world of the Rebbe, just like a mitzvah is not an accessory to a higher emotion, but its primary target, its primary recipient, the physical, non-sublime piece of dough mixed together with water in a decidedly limited time frame of within 18 minutes, very much locked in to the constraints of time and space, is the goal, is the objective. And thinking along those lines suddenly creates an opportunity for you to look at your own life, spiritually speaking, emotionally, psychologically, and to start paying closer attention to the dark corners of your life, the places of fear, the places of sadness, the places of deep and abiding trauma. Typically, we are trained, we are conditioned to steamroll over those places on our way to our real journey, to our real destination. And we leapfrog over those emotions, and if the emotions are too large, so we engage them, albeit begrudgingly. In the world of the Rebbe, there is no superfluous emotion. In fact, any experience that is part of the parameters of what our life looks like is fair game, is the tachton. The dark spaces are not places to avoid, but they are destinations that are valuable unto themselves. And they exist precisely to gauge the quality of our interaction with them. They don't exist for us to bypass them. They exist because there's something about the way we interact with our own uncertainties, with our own confusions, with our own unhealthy states, that is a critical piece that we have to, a piece of the puzzle that's missing, that takes on the shape of whatever it is that we struggle with, that we have to fill. And that is an extension of that purposefulness of Torah that finds itself ironically engaged with the physical world. That sets the tone for us l'taken et ha'olam b'malchut Shaddai, as we say it, to bring to re-encompass the disenfranchised parts of ourselves, alongside with the disenfranchised, with the distanced pieces of the physical world, by practicing inclusion. We are practicing Judaism. And the more of the world we bring in, the more we are recognizing and realizing the purposeness aspect of Judaism. And the Rebbe broadened that to see anything that was, he challenged us to look at whatever it was that was on the outside and recalibrate its settings to allow it to ensure that it was encompassed and brought to the inside. And in this way, that was the breaking of the barrier between heaven and earth. And in recognizing that, we have the opportunity spiritually to be far more enriched than we would be in bypassing the seemingly trite and prosaic details of Shulchan Aruch, because in doing so, we're actually promoting a more holistic and a more inclusive and healthy emotional and spiritual persona. So just a couple of things to think about on this special week of Matan Torah, Yom Tov. I wish you all a great day, and somewhere along the way today, if you stumble upon something that is something, an opportunity, perhaps look at it differently. Perhaps something that came into your field of vision or into your experience is something that needs you. And if it's something that you would typically dismiss, think about the paradigm that we've created here today, and perhaps rethink that and figure out how to encompass and to address whatever it is that came into your path, because that's destiny. Yom Tov.
Yom Tov. Question.